It's pretty wild when you think about it. In the few decades after the Civil War, the United States went from a country mostly concerned with its own internal business to a full-blown global power with an overseas empire. I mean, that's a massive and incredibly fast transformation. So how on earth did a nation so focused on its own backyard suddenly start planting its flag all over the world?
I know. It sounds a little dramatic, right? But the story of America's imperial rise can seriously be traced back to a single catastrophic explosion in a Cuban harbor. That one event kicked off a domino effect that would completely redefine America's place in the world. So let's follow that first domino. But okay, before we get to the explosion itself, we need to set the stage. Because that explosion didn't happen in a vacuum. The idea of an American empire, of flexing American muscle on the world stage, well, that was already brewing. The country was basically primed and ready for expansion. It just needed a trigger. To really get what's going on here, we have to talk about this one big word, imperialism. Now, it's not just about conquering land. It's the whole policy of pushing your country's power and influence way beyond its own borders, whether you do that with treaties and money or with soldiers and guns. So why the sudden urge to expand? Well, it boils down to a few key things. First, Americans were looking across the ocean and seeing European nations carving up Africa and Asia, and there was this serious fear of being left out of the game. It was about prestige. At the same time, you had influential guys like Alfred T. Mahan arguing that to be a true world power, you had to have a dominant navy. Then you had politicians like Henry Cabot Lodge really pushing for a more aggressive, expansionist foreign policy. And let's be honest, you always have to follow the money. There were huge economic interests at stake, especially with the dream of one day building and controlling a canal in Central America. So you've got all these ideas bubbling under the surface. Ambition, fear, greed. They just needed a flashpoint. And that flashpoint was waiting just 90 miles off the coast of Florida in Cuba. This is where the idea of empire was about to get very, very real. For years, the situation in Cuba had been getting messy. Cuban rebels were locked in this really bloody war for independence from Spain. Now, this chaos, happening so close to home, was a huge problem for the U.S. For one, it directly challenged the Monroe Doctrine, the long-standing American policy of telling European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Washington was watching closely and getting very, very impatient for things to calm down. Tensions were already simmering, and then this letter drops like a bomb. It's a private letter from the Spanish ambassador, Dupuy de Lome, that gets stolen and leaked to the American press. In it, he calls the U.S. President, William McKinley, weak and basically just a wannabe politician. To the American public, this was a massive insult, and people were absolutely furious. And then this happened. The spark. On February 15th, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine, which was sitting in Havana Harbor just to keep an eye on things, suddenly exploded. It sank, and more than 260 American sailors died. The American press, which was deep in its era of sensational yellow journalism, didn't wait for an investigation. As you can see from this headline, they immediately blamed Spain. Now, historians today are pretty sure it was a tragic accident, probably a fire in a coal bunker next to the ammunition. But that's not the story the American people heard. The public outcry was deafening, and Remember the Maine became the war cry that swept the nation. With the public screaming for war, the pressure was just too much. President McKinley, who had actually tried to avoid a fight, was backed into a corner. America was going to war. A war that one official would later, kind of ironically, call a splendid little war. The war itself was fought on two fronts, literally oceans apart. The first shots weren't even fired in Cuba. They were fired halfway around the world in the Philippines, where an American fleet under Commodore George Dewey just completely wiped out the Spanish Navy there. But of course, the main event was in Cuba, and that's where a volunteer cavalry unit called the Rough Riders, led by a certain up-and-comer named Theodore Roosevelt, became legendary after their famous charge up San Juan Hill. When all the dust settled, the number of American soldiers actually killed in combat was, well, shockingly low. Just 281. I mean, just think about that number for a second. 281 combat deaths. For a war that would literally create a global empire for the United States, that seems like an almost unbelievably small price to pay.
But that number is misleading, because that wasn't the real butcher's bill. The real killer in this war wasn't a Spanish rifle. It was disease. Over 2,500 American soldiers died from sickness.
Yup, the true enemy wasn't the Spanish army at all. It was things like malaria, typhoid, and yellow fever. These tropical diseases are almost 10 times deadlier than Spanish bullets. It's a pretty sobering reality check on that whole splendid little war idea.
The whole thing was over in less than 4 months. Victory was incredibly swift. But winning the war, it turns out, was the easy part. The real challenge, the true price of victory, was suddenly having to figure out what the heck to do with a brand new overseas empire. And just like that, for a cool $20 million, the U.S. acquired a whole portfolio of new territories from Spain. The Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico were all handed over. Cuba was technically granted independence, but it stayed under heavy American influence for decades. Practically overnight, the United States had an empire that stretched from the Caribbean Sea all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But, of course, with any big victory party comes the morning after hangover, and this was a bad one. In the Philippines, Filipino rebels who had fought with the U.S. against Spain now felt betrayed. They turned their guns on the Americans, kicking off a brutal and bloody war that would last for years and kill far, far more people than the Spanish-American War ever did. And now, having territory in Asia meant the U.S. was officially a player in that part of the world, leading to new policies like the Open Door Policy, designed to make sure America could get its piece of the trade pie in China. This new, muscular America needed a leader to match, and boy, did it get one. The hero of San Juan Hill, the man who would come to define America's new assertive foreign policy, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, just look at this trajectory. It's absolutely meteoric. He masterfully used his fame from the war to become governor of New York, then vice president. And then, in 1901, President McKinley was assassinated. And suddenly, the war hero himself was in the White House, ready to lead this new American empire. And Roosevelt wasted no time. For decades, the U.S. had the Monroe Doctrine, which basically just told Europe, hey, stay out of our backyard. But Roosevelt added his own major twist, the Roosevelt Corollary. It went a huge step further. It said that if any country in Latin America was acting up, the United States had the right to step in and act as an international police power. It was a massive change. Roosevelt's whole philosophy was summed up in his famous phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Basically, be ready and willing to use military force to get what you want. And the perfect case study is the Panama Canal. The U.S. wanted to build it, but Colombia, which controlled Panama at the time, said no to their deal. So Roosevelt's response? The U.S. backed a rebellion, Panama declared its independence, and the new nation of Panama immediately gave the U.S. the rights to the canal zone. That right there was the big stick in action. Now, Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, tweaked the strategy a bit. Instead of threatening with military force, the big stick, Taft preferred what came to be called dollar diplomacy. The idea was to use American money, investments, and economic power to influence other countries. You could say he wanted to substitute dollars for bullets. The tools were different, but the goal, extending American influence, was exactly the same. So there you have it. From one single, chaotic spark in a harbor in Cuba, a chain of events was set off that led to a war, an empire, and a complete redefinition of America's role on the world stage. It set the course for the entire 20th century, and it really leaves us with a big question to think about. What are the echoes of that empire and that big stick that we can still see in American foreign policy today?